What if the single most overlooked strategic advantage, the thing that could transform cities, institutions, whole systems, wasn't some new tech or, a market trend?
Yeah, what if it's something much older, something urgently relevant right now?
Exactly. What if the most powerful strategy in your leadership toolbox isn't another productivity hack, not another data model, but a pause?
A deliberate pause.
Yeah.
A spirit-attuned act of prayer. And here's the kicker. It doesn't slow momentum. The claim is, it generates it.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really tearing into a stack of sources that push this surprising perspective. They look at prayer not just as a personal comfort or some private ritual,
but as a powerful, genuinely strategic force, something that actively shapes real-world outcomes, like in the big arenas of life.
Right. So our mission today in this deep dive is to unpack that argument. It's a compelling one. These sources, they make a pretty bold claim.
They really do. That movement without divine alignment, it's basically momentum heading in the wrong direction. It leads to frustration, burnout.
Stuff that doesn't last.
Exactly. And they position prayer as the essential first step, like the missing link for effective, truly transformational action. Doesn't matter if you're leading a business, a nonprofit, your family, anywhere you have influence.
So get ready, because this might challenge some of your assumptions. Assumptions about prayer, yeah, but also about leadership, about influence itself.
Because, according to these sources, when you engage this dimension of prayer, it opens up this whole realm, you could say, a realm of possibility.
Where leadership isn't just about juggling complexity.
Right. It's about actually partnering with the divine to create change that, endures.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's rip into these sources and really unpack this. It sounds pretty revolutionary.
So let's start with that core concept, the one that really flips things, flips conventional wisdom on its head. Pray first, move fast.
Yeah, because our culture, especially a results-driven culture, it tells us the exact opposite, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Plan fast, act faster, scale immediately, don't stop.
Absolutely. Go, go, go. It feels totally counterintuitive to everything we learn about efficiency, hitting targets.
Right. Prayer is maybe something you tack on at the end, or like a quiet moment before the real work starts.
That's the typical view. But the bold truth these sources are presenting is that prioritizing action before you get that divine alignment, well, that often leads straight to burnout.
Or initiatives that look great, sound great, but just fizzle out. They don't create lasting change.
Exactly. Or you're working incredibly hard, putting in all the effort, but somehow it just misses the mark. That kind of momentum, they argue, is often taking you, frankly, in the wrong direction.
Okay, so this isn't just wishful thinking then, like cross your fingers and hope. It's being framed as an actual strategic framework.
Precisely. It's described as a powerful framework, proven, they'd argue, where prayer is the absolute first strategic act. It's not secondary.
It's the engine room.
Yeah, it's the engine. It's what fuels genuinely rapid, genuinely effective action. The insight, the clarity, the alignment you gain in prayer, that's what makes the movement that follows actually meaningful, impactful in the real visible world.
And this connects directly to that phrase you mentioned, from room to realm.
That's the key metaphor running through all these sources, really. Prayer so often gets confined to the room, right? Your private space, your quiet time, your prayer closet.
Which is important, obviously.
Crucial. But this perspective says the room isn't the final destination. It's the launchpad. The goal is to see prayer as this dynamic force that actually shifts things out there in the realm.
The public world, the systems, the structures, all that stuff around us.
Exactly. Governments, economies, schools, media, the realm.
So it's not prayer as escapism.
Yeah.
Trying to get away from the world.
No, it's prayer as engagement with the world. That's a really critical distinction they make. It's not just ritual for ritual's sake. It's strategy for impact's sake. Prayer that's intended to build things up, to disrupt injustice, to reform broken systems, and to release, divine potential into the world around us.
Prayer that shapes culture, not just retreats from it.
That's the idea.
Okay, conceptually, that makes a kind of radical sense. But where does this idea actually come from? Is it new, or does it have deeper roots?
Oh, it definitely has deeper roots. The sources ground this whole concept firmly in what they call a biblical blueprint.
Okay.
They argue that when Jesus told his followers to pray in the room in Matthew 6.6, he wasn't telling them to isolate their faith from their life. Not at all.
It wasn't about hiding away.
No, it was about establishing that secret place of power, The launchpad for public impact. The room is where you connect to the source, you get your alignment before you launch out into the mission.
And Jesus himself, I mean, he certainly didn't just stay in the room, did he?
Far from it. Look at the Gospels. When Jesus prayed, the realm, the world around him, it responded. Systems trembled.
Oh.
Well, storms on the Sea of Galilee were stilled, right? That's engaging with environmental systems. Food multiplied for thousands, that's engaging economic systems, resource systems.
Like the loaves and fishes.
Exactly. And political powers like Herod, Pilate, they reacted strongly to his influence. That's engaging governmental systems. Prayer wasn't just an internal state for Jesus. It was a prophetic act. It brought heavenly reality crashing into earthly systems.
That's a powerful way to frame those familiar stories. Can you give us some more specific examples, maybe from the Old Testament, that the sources highlight?
Absolutely. Think about Daniel. Daniel in Babylon, he had this incredibly powerful, consistent private prayer life, didn't he? 3 times a day.
Yeah, lion's den and all that.
Right. But the point the sources make is that this wasn't just for his personal spiritual comfort. His private devotion directly shaped public policy. It influenced the actual laws of mighty empires like Babylon and Persia. His personal room time had massive realm impact.
Laws of empires. That's a huge scale for one person's prayers.
It is. Or think about Nehemiah. Before he goes in to speak to King Artaxerxes, to ask for permission to go rebuild Jerusalem's walls, a huge political ask.
Yeah.
Nehemiah 2, verse 4 says he prayed to the God of heaven. It was likely a silent, maybe instantaneous prayer right there in the king's presence. And that prayer, that moment of alignment, is presented as what sparked the rebuilding of an entire city's infrastructure.
Wow. Infrastructure rebuilt.
Right.
Through spiritual alignment before a single stone was laid physically.
That really drives home the strategic part, doesn't it? And the realm aspect. It wasn't just about feelings, it was about city walls.
Definitely. Any others?
Oh, yeah. Elijah on Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 18. His prayer directly shifted weather patterns, ending a 3-year drought. That's pretty systemic.
That's big.
But it was more than just the weather. It shifted the national spiritual climate. It confronted the entrenched system of Baal worship, challenged idolatry, and turned a whole nation, at least momentarily, back towards God.
So societal level change.
Absolutely. And then there's the early church. Acts chapter 4. After Peter and John are released from questioning, they gather with the believers and pray. And verse 31 says the place where they were meeting was literally shaken.
The building shook.
The building shook. But the sources emphasize the real power wasn't just the shaking building. It was that the prayer shook their courage. It filled them with boldness for public witness, which massively disrupted the religious and political status quo of Jerusalem.
So in every single one of these examples, Daniel, Nehemiah, Elijah, the early church prayer wasn't some separate spiritual thing happening off to the side.
Not at all. It was deeply intertwined with the major systems of their day. Political power, environmental forces, religious structures, social norms. Prayer intersected all of them.
It was the bridge, the connection point between the unseen reality of God's will and the visible realm where things happen.
That's exactly how the sources frame it.
Now, what's really fascinating, I think, is how the sources talk about prayer, not just as, communication with God, talking to him, but almost as a form of governance with God. That sounds different.
It is. And this is where that idea of the realm gets even deeper. The sources suggest that these systems we see in the world, governments, economies, education, media, arts, even family structures, they aren't just neutral human creations.
Okay.
They exist under a kind of, let's say, spiritual jurisdiction. Ephesians 6.9 hints at this, talking about spiritual forces, principalities, and powers, operating in unseen realms that influence earthly structures. The idea is that every system reflects, or is influenced by, an underlying spiritual reality.
And prayer is how we engage with that underlying spiritual reality that's influencing the visible system we see.
Yes. That's the core idea. Prayer becomes the means, the tool for discerning what's really going on beneath the surface issues in a system. Why is this injustice so persistent? Why does this pattern keep repeating?
Getting to the root.
Exactly. And then prayer allows us to disrupt the injustice by challenging the spiritual strongholds, the negative spiritual influences that might be empowering those systems. And then to begin rebuilding according to God's original design, his blueprint. Releasing heavenly order where there's been earthly chaos.
This almost sounds, legal. Like we're in some kind of divine courtroom.
That's actually an analogy the sources use quite a bit. They emphasize this isn't just flowery, metaphorical language. Prayer, they argue, often mirrors the language and processes you see in heavenly courts, with decrees, covenants, judgments, concepts you find in places like Job chapter 1, where Satan presents himself before God, or Daniel 7, verse 10, where the court was seated and the books were opened.
Okay, wow.
It's framed as heaven actively collaborating with humanity, with believers, to see God's will established and justice enacted on earth.
So prayer is part of how divine justice and God's purposes are actually carried out, executed on earth.
In a very real sense, yes. It's described as a dialogue, an interaction between heavenly authority and earthly participants, specifically believers who Revelation 1 verse 6 calls kings and priests unto God.
Kings and priests.
Right. So prayer is seen as the space where divine authority flows through praying people to execute heavenly decrees like verdicts or rulings from that heavenly court in specific earthly contexts. It's about reclaiming a kind of delegated governmental authority that believers are meant to walk in.
Okay, kings and priests praying. That hints at maybe different ways of praying, different kinds of authority involved. The sources mentioned 3 spheres, I think.
They do, yeah. They break it down helpfully into 3 dimensions or spheres of prayer authority. First, there's what they call priestly authority.
Okay.
This is essentially intercession, as we often think of it, standing in the gap for others, representing their needs, their situations, before God with compassion, like a priest mediating between God and the people.
Right, praying for people, praying for situations. That feels pretty familiar.
It is. It's foundational. But then second, there's prophetic authority in prayer.
Prophetic, meaning.
This involves prayer that is focused on listening first. Listening for God's heart, his mind, his perspective on a situation or a system. It's about discerning divine timing, understanding the root spiritual issues, seeing what God sees, and then praying with that specific insight for course correction according to his revealed will. It's hearing before you speak.
So praying with specific insight and divine direction, not just guessing.
Exactly. Much more targeted. And third, there's kingly authority. This is the one that really pushes the governance idea.
Kingly authority in prayer.
Yeah. The sources describe this as governing prayer. It comes from praying from a place of spiritual seatedness with Christ in heavenly places, referencing Ephesians 2, verse 6. From that position of authority, it involves making declarations, issuing decrees, enforcing heavenly verdicts on earthly situations. The idea is kings don't typically beg for things that are rightfully theirs or within their jurisdiction. They issue decrees based on established law. So this is prayer that actively governs, establishes, and legislates from a heavenly perspective.
Priestly, prophetic, kingly. Wow. That gives a real structure to different kinds of prayer, different dimensions of it. But maybe zooming back out for a second, why do these big complex systems and structures, governments, economies, media, education, why do they matter so much to God in the first place? Aren't they just human constructs, part of the messy, fallen world?
That's a great question. But from the perspective laid out in these sources, the answer is no. They're not just human constructs to be ignored by spiritual people. They point directly to Colossians chapter 1, verses 16 and 17.
What does that say?
It says that all things were created by Christ, and for Christ, things visible and invisible. And it specifically lists thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, these systemic things.
So governments, authorities, they were created by and for Jesus.
According to Paul, yes. They exist ultimately for his purposes, even when they've gone way off track. They're meant to ultimately bring him glory and reflect his order. So the argument follows. If Jesus has ultimate authority over these systems, then believers, as his representatives on earth, are meant to engage them, not ignore them or just complain about them.
And prayer is the primary way we do that, the primary means of engagement.
That's exactly the argument. It's the primary way we partner with Christ's authority over those systems.
So this whole deep dive, it really isn't just about, personal spiritual growth or finding comfort. Those are good things.
No, it's much bigger than that. It's about being equipped, really, to engage in a larger, often unseen conflict.
Okay.
The sources present prayer not just in pastoral terms, caring, comforting, but fundamentally as engaging in spiritual warfare, like stepping into a war room or even a legislative chamber where kingdom policies are debated and decreed. It's where the battles for the destiny of systems, cities, regions are often waged first.
Spiritual warfare. Now, that's a phrase that, it carries a lot of different meanings for different people, doesn't it? What exactly do the sources mean by that in this context?
Yeah, it can be loaded. But here, they link it directly to that famous passage about the armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6. Right after listing all the pieces of armor, Paul says in verse 18, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests.
So prayer is part of the armor, or maybe how you use it.
Exactly. Prayer is presented as how we actively engage the spiritual powers and principalities that Paul talks about, the forces that oppose God's will and work to undermine his purposes in families, institutions, nations. It's not seen as passive, not a last resort when all else fails.
It's the front line.
It's the active frontline way we confront spiritual opposition that is influencing earthly realities.
Like that Daniel 10 example we touched on earlier. That fits here.
Perfectly. Remember, Daniel prays for 21 days, persistently. And the angel who finally shows up explains he was delayed because he was in a major spiritual conflict, a battle against the Prince of Persia, a spiritual power influencing that empire.
Right.
Daniel's persistent prayer wasn't just a personal struggle for an answer. It initiated and sustained a major spiritual confrontation in the unseen realm, described almost like geopolitical warfare between angelic and demonic forces that directly impacted events on Earth by releasing that angelic help.
Wow.
So the sources frame this kind of prayer as acting like a heavenly command center. You're directing spiritual forces, disrupting enemy strategies that are influencing earthly rulers or situations.
A heavenly command center.
Yeah.
Initiated by prayer from earth. That's mind-blowing, really.
Yeah.
And how does the Lord's Prayer fit into this? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. 96.10.
The sources see that as incredibly strategic. They call it a strategic manifesto, not just a nice, pious request.
It's manifesto.
Yeah. Your kingdom come. That's seen as a demand. A bold call for divine governmental invasion. For God's rule, God's way of doing things, to actively enter and influence the earthly realm right now.
And your will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
That's seen as a decree, a declaration, a call for divine policy, God's perfect will, which is already settled in heaven, to be implemented right here on earth. It's asking, demanding for heavenly reality to overwrite and transform earthly reality.
So prayer isn't about trying to persuade a reluctant God to maybe do something he's not sure about.
No, that's a key theological point they make. The foundation is that God's will is already established in heaven. He wants his kingdom to come, his will to be done. Strategic intercession, then, is about aligning ourselves with that already settled will.
Okay.
And then enforcing it, or partnering with God to see it enforced on earth against any opposition. Matthew 18.8 is huge here. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven.
That binding and loosing language.
It's legal terminology. Bind, loose. It suggests believers praying in alignment with God's will are given authority to enforce divine jurisdiction, to say no to things that oppose God's will, binding, and yes to releasing God's purposes, loosing in specific situations.
Enforcers of divine jurisdiction. That's a really powerful, almost startling way to put it.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it highlights that this kind of prayer involves both deep discernment hearing and seeing what God is actually doing and wanting to do, like Jesus modeled. Remember John 5.1, hon? He said he only did what he saw the Father doing.
Right, that intimate connection.
That's the discernment part. But then there's also deployment, actively enforcing God's will, releasing his power, making those declarations based on what you've seen and heard. Jesus withdrew to pray before big decisions, big actions, precisely because prayer was how he got his tactical blueprint, his strategy from the Father.
Okay, this completely shifts the picture for me. From prayer being just asking for needs, maybe confession, to active engagement, strategic influence, even enforcement. It's huge. But the big question is, does it actually work? Does this strategic prayer really change things in the real world? What does it look like in action?
Yeah, that's the bottom line, isn't it? And according to the sources we looked at, the answer is a resounding yes. They provide some really compelling examples, stories, case studies of how this kind of targeted strategic prayer seems to have tangibly impacted real-world systems and outcomes.
Okay, give us some examples. Let's get practical.
Well, for city transformation, a frequently cited example is Cali, Colombia. Years ago, it was notorious, right? Drug cartels, violence.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
Well, the sources describe how unified, targeted prayer movements began across different denominations in the city. Pastors and believers started intentionally engaging the spiritual realities they discerned were holding the city captive.
And what happened?
The reports are pretty dramatic. Measurable transformation, significant drops in crime rates over time, exposure of corrupt officials, a palpable shift in the city's overall atmosphere, becoming known more for faith than fear. It's presented as a clear case where intentional strategic prayer preceded and fueled significant social and governmental change.
Wow.
And similar kinds of stories are told about shifts linked to prayer movements in places like Uganda, parts of South Korea, other areas.
That's incredible. Citywide shifts linked back to prayer. What about institutions maybe closer to home for many listeners, like schools or local government?
Yeah, the sources argue that strategic intercession impacts education and government systems too. The underlying idea is that prayer can do things lobbying or protesting alone can't. It can actually soften hardened hearts within complex bureaucracies. It can invite divine disruption.
Divine disruption.
Yeah, like opening doors that seemed permanently locked shut, influencing policy decisions in unexpected positive ways, or sometimes even leading to the removal of leaders who were actively promoting injustice. Examples mentioned include prayer movements that reportedly influenced specific policy discussions in Indonesia, or helped sustain the church and civil society during difficult times in parts of Eastern Europe. And on a smaller scale, teachers and school administrators who've prioritized praying specifically over their schools, the students, the staff, the challenges report tangible shifts, fewer behavioral incidents, a different feel in the hallways.
That's fascinating. And how does this apply to, say, local churches and their outreach or community work?
This is absolutely key, according to the sources. They argue that when a local church shifts its prayer focus beyond just internal needs and starts prioritizing targeted intercession for their community, for specific outreach efforts, they see unusual levels of openness and effectiveness.
So prayer isn't just supporting the real work of evangelism.
They'd say it births it prepares the ground. They talk about something called strategic prayer mapping.
Prayer mapping, what's that?
It's basically doing your homework, spiritually speaking. Researching the history of a place, understanding its cultural dynamics, discerning the specific needs, and maybe the spiritual strongholds or negative patterns operating in a neighborhood or community.
So you know what you're praying about with precision.
Exactly. It moves outreach from just trying to fix surface problems to effectively loving people into wholeness because you've addressed some of the underlying spiritual resistance through prayer first.
Got it.
One source shared this great little story. A church decided to hold a neighborhood BBQ, simple outreach. But before they did anything else, they dedicated 21 days to specific, targeted prayer just for that neighborhood and the upcoming event.
21 days of prayer beforehand.
Yeah. And the result? Compared to previous similar events, they had double the attendance. But more than that, the conversations were much deeper, more meaningful, and several people who came, unchurched people, specifically said they felt somehow inexplicably drawn to come. It felt, the church leader said, like the prayer had lowered spiritual resistance and prepared people's hearts.
That's a really tangible, practical example. Okay, and what about for individuals?
Yeah.
For leaders, whether in ministry, business, community, how does this translate personally?
The sources emphasize that leaders who really adopt this pray before you plan kind of discipline consistently experience significant personal transformation first, and that transformation then naturally impacts their spheres of influence.
How so? What changes?
Well, prayer helps leaders gain immense clarity, especially in complex or confusing situations. It helps them seek and receive God's unique perspective, which is often very different from the world's. It sharpens their discernment, helps them make better judgment calls. It also gives them access to divine wisdom and power that goes way beyond their natural abilities or experience. And maybe most importantly, it cultivates essential leadership qualities like genuine humility, compassion, and a healthy dependence on God rather than just relying on their own strength or cleverness.
So it fundamentally shifts the core posture of leadership itself.
Absolutely. It moves leadership away from relying purely on autonomy, human strategy, available resources, towards prioritizing dependence on divine direction and partnership. It helps leaders align with God's purpose, not just chase conventional metrics like profit or growth. It even reframes how they see crises, not just as problems to be solved, but as opportunities for God to step in and demonstrate his leadership through them in surprising ways.
Any stories there?
Yeah, a couple were shared. One about a CEO who felt prompted in prayer to delay a major business decision, even though all the data looked good. He paused, waited. And shortly after, information came to light that showed the deal would have led to a significant scandal. His pause, prompted by prayer, saved the company.
Wow.
Another was about a pastor whose church board committed to serious prayer before any strategic planning meetings. Over time, this led them down paths they never would have considered based on logic alone, resulting in profound, unexpected community transformation far beyond the church walls.
Incredible stories. So, okay, if this is the vision prayer, as this powerful, strategic, realm-impacting force, How does someone actually do this? How do you move from just praying about personal needs to this deeper, more influential kind of intercession? The sources must offer some practical steps, right?
They definitely do. They lay out some really helpful guidance for cultivating this kind of strategic intercession, both for individuals and for groups or churches.
Great, let's hear them.
Okay, first they say, expand your prayer grid. Simple but profound. Don't stop praying for your personal needs, your family, your church. But don't stop there either. Intentionally start praying over the systems that impact your life and your community.
Like what?
Government leaders and policies, local and national, economic issues, injustice, media influence, educational institutions in your area, healthcare systems. Pray for the realm, not just in your private room.
Makes sense. Pray bitter. What's next?
Second, pray with scriptural precision. Use the Bible not just for inspiration, but as your playbook, even your legal precedent in prayer. Find God's stated promises, his intentions, his commands regarding justice, righteousness, the nations, and declare his word over those situations with boldness. Align your prayers with his revealed will.
So using the word as the actual foundation and substance of your prayer.
Exactly. Third, don't always try to do this alone. Join, or maybe even form, a strategic intercession group. The sources really emphasize the multiplied power of corporate prayer. When believers agree together on earth concerning God's will, asking according to his word, heaven moves in uniquely powerful ways. There's a synergy, a multiplication of spiritual authority and effectiveness.
There's definitely something powerful about praying together with others for bigger things.
Absolutely. Fourth, they suggest cultivating a discipline of documenting, discerning, and declaring. Keep some kind of prayer journal, maybe. Track the insights you receive, the scriptures God highlights, the specific things you're praying for, and importantly, the answers you see.
Why document?
It helps you discern patterns over time. It builds faith as you see answers. It helps you hear God's voice more clearly. And crucially, tied to this is persistence. Don't just pray about something once and forget it. The sources encourage praying until you see the breakthrough, the shift God has promised or put on your heart.
Pray until. Yeah, that requires real tenacity, doesn't it?
It really does. Which leads to the fifth point. Adopt a priestly mindset. Regularly ask yourself that question from Ezekiel 22.3. Where can I stand in the gap today? See yourself as a spiritual advocate, positioned by God to pray on behalf of others, on behalf of your city, your nation, the systems around you, rather than just being a passive observer or, worse, just a critic.
Stepping actively into that role of advocate through prayer. And you mentioned spiritual mapping again earlier. How does that fit into the practical steps?
Right, that's the sixth point. Engaging in spiritual mapping. This means intentionally researching, asking questions, seeking to understand the historical background, the cultural dynamics, and the underlying spiritual atmosphere or influences of a specific place or an organization or a system that you feel called to pray for.
Like doing reconnaissance before a battle.
That's a decent analogy, yeah. You use tools like historical research, demographic data, conversations with knowledgeable people, and spiritual discernment to try and understand what forces, both good and bad, might be shaping that environment. This gives you incredible insight for targeted, effective prayer, knowing what to bind, what to loose, referencing principles like in 2 Corinthians 10 about pulling down strongholds.
That makes prayer incredibly informed, not just generic.
Totally. It moves way beyond vague requests. Okay, seventh point. Always seek to combine prayer with action. Strategic intercession should fuel righteous, wise action. It doesn't replace it.
Ah, okay. So it's not just prayer.
No. Your prayer should ideally lead you to concrete efforts. Maybe it's community service. Maybe it's ethical leadership in your workplace. Maybe it's advocating for just policies. Maybe it's simple acts of love and service, all rooted in the insights and the power you gained in prayer. It's not prayer or action. It's prayer and action, with prayer often leading the way, empowering the action.
Got it. Prayer is the power source for the action.
Exactly. Eighth, actively cultivate prophetic sensitivity. Learn to listen more than you speak in prayer. This kind of strategic prayer isn't just a monologue to God, it's a dialogue. It involves actively listening for his voice, his insights, his specific directions on how to pray, or what specific action he might be highlighting for you to take. Ask the Holy Spirit to reveal the root issues behind the surface problems you see.
Listening is key.
Crucial. And finally, number 9, just to reiterate, remember that persistence is absolutely essential. Real breakthroughs in the realm, shifts in long-standing systems or situations, often follow prolonged, focused, tenacious intercession. Think of Daniel's 21 days. Think of the early church praying without ceasing until Peter was miraculously released from prison in Acts 12. Don't give up easily.
Wow. That's a comprehensive picture. We've taken a really deep dive today into this profound, maybe challenging idea of prayer as a genuinely strategic, even governmental force, seeing it move from the quiet of a private room.
Right, out into the public realm, actively impacting the systems and structures that shape our world.
We've looked at how it's deeply rooted in biblical accounts, how it's described by these sources as operating with real authority, engaging in spiritual warfare.
And we've heard some compelling examples, according to these sources, of its tangible impact on entire cities, on institutions like schools and governments, on the effectiveness of local churches, and even on the transformation of individual leaders.
It fundamentally challenges us, doesn't it? To see prayer not as just a helpful supplement we add to our plans after we figured everything out,
Right, not an add-on.
but as the essential first move,
Yeah.
the primary engine,
Yeah.
the launchpad, maybe even the blueprint itself for any truly effective action in whatever sphere of influence we have.
Yeah, it really reframes the whole thing. It means prayer isn't primarily about trying to convince a reluctant God to maybe bless our limited, often flawed ideas.
Which is how we often approach it, isn't it?
It is, but this view says it's much more about aligning ourselves with his vast, perfect, creative ideas and then partnering with him through prayer and action to see those ideas enforced and established right here on earth as they already are in heaven.
So, thinking about all this, what does it mean for you, listening right now, as you go about your day, your week? Here's a thought to maybe wrestle with, to mull over.
What core assumptions or beliefs might you currently hold? Beliefs about leadership, about influence, about how real-world change actually happens. That might need to be challenged or released or redefined. If you were to truly embrace prayer as a primary strategic foundational force in your own life and in the systems you touch every day,